And he was in a mood at that time. He says, I don't want to do any more violent pictures. I'm tired of it. I've been involved with a lot of them. He says,
There was a time when Clint Eastwood didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. A single glance, a quiet pause, and the entire set would fall into rhythm. For more than 6 decades, he built a reputation not just as a star, but as a standard, disciplined, efficient, uncompromising. Awards followed, box office followed, respect followed. But behind that steady exterior were moments the audience never saw. Long days, creative clashes, strong personalities that refused to bend. Because greatness does not exist without resistance. Now, at 95, in a season of reflection shaped by pride and hard-earned wisdom, Eastwood is finally looking back and naming the 6 actors who tested his patience, challenged his methods, and left a permanent mark on his legacy. Number 1. Sondra Locke. The first real test did not begin with an argument. It began with trust. When Clint Eastwood cast Sondra Locke in The Outlaw Josie Wales, there was a quiet certainty between them. On set, he moved the way he always did. Minimal takes, no wasted motion, no dramatic speeches. She watched him carefully, learning his rhythm, and for a time, their worlds aligned. Crew members would later describe the atmosphere as calm, almost intimate. He valued efficiency. She valued expression. At first, the contrast felt electric. 2 strong wills working in parallel. But parallel lines do not always stay aligned. As the years passed and the films continued, Locke began seeking more creative control. She wanted to direct, to shape stories from behind the lens. Eastwood, disciplined and protective of his production system, believed in structure. Tight schedules, clear hierarchy, no chaos. No shouting matches were reported. No dramatic confrontations. The tension was quieter than that. It showed in pauses, in decisions delayed, in conversations that ended without resolution. And when their personal relationship fractured, the professional partnership collapsed with it. Lawsuits followed. Headlines followed. What had once been collaboration became distance. Eastwood rarely spoke about it publicly. He did not name blame. He did not dramatize the ending. But those close to the productions understood. This was a chapter that tested his belief that discipline alone could hold everything together. Because sometimes control is not enough. And this would not be the last time a strong personality pushed against his methods. The next challenge would not be personal. It would be professional. 2 towering presences, 1 set, and no room for ego. Number 2, Gene Hackman. By the time Gene Hackman stepped onto the set of Unforgiven, he was already a force. 2 Academy Awards, a reputation for immersion so complete it could unsettle a room. He prepared deeply, lived inside his characters, demanded emotional authenticity in every frame. Across from him stood Clint Eastwood, older now, deliberate, directing as he acted. Eastwood believed in economy, rarely more than a few takes, no endless rehearsals. Capture the truth, then move on. 2 philosophies, both successful, both uncompromising. On paper, it was a masterstroke, Eastwood directing and starring opposite Hackman in a Western that would later win Best Picture. But behind the camera, the energy was different from Eastwood's usual sets. Hackman liked to explore variations. He would test emotional shades, stretch moments, search for nuance in repetition. Eastwood preferred instinct. First take carried honesty. Second take refined it. Third take was often unnecessary. There were no public explosions, no tabloid-worthy confrontations, but crew members noticed the subtle friction. The way pacing shifted when Hackman pressed for another attempt. The way Eastwood's jaw tightened when schedules extended. It wasn't hostility, it was gravity meeting gravity. In interviews, Eastwood later acknowledged Hackman's brilliance. He respected the craft, but respect does not erase tension. Working styles shape atmosphere, and atmosphere shapes performance. The film became a triumph. Awards followed. History was kind to both men. Yet that production reinforced something Eastwood had already begun to learn. Strong actors do not simply fit into a system, they reshape it. And as his career moved forward, he would encounter different kinds of resistance. Not romantic, not purely stylistic. The next challenge would be ideological, where belief systems, not camera angles, created distance. Number 3. Charlton Heston. The next tension did not rise from performance. It rose from principle. Clint Eastwood had always guarded his independence, politically, creatively, personally. He resisted labels. He avoided rigid affiliations. His worldview was shaped less by party lines and more by individual code, self-reliance, discipline, personal responsibility. Across the industry stood figures like Charlton Heston, equally iconic, equally commanding, but publicly vocal in ways Eastwood rarely was. Heston embraced visible activism, stepped into leadership roles, and allowed his political identity to become inseparable from his public image. The two men represented different versions of American masculinity, both strong, both principled, but expressed in contrasting ways. There were no headline feuds between them, no recorded shouting matches. The tension was subtler, the kind that exists when two powerful figures understand that their convictions would never fully align. In industry gatherings, in private conversations, in the broader cultural shifts of Hollywood, their approaches symbolized diverging paths. Eastwood preferred quiet positioning. He would speak occasionally, carefully. Heston stood at podiums, unapologetic and clear. One leaned into reflection, the other into declaration. For Eastwood, this reinforced something he had already felt during earlier collaborations. Strength takes many forms, but not all forms coexist comfortably. When belief systems enter a room, creative space tightens. Because film sets are not isolated from the world outside them. They carry the era's arguments, its cultural debates, its ideological lines. And as decades passed, Eastwood continued to encounter actors whose intensity came not from romance or rehearsal style, but from generational shifts themselves. The next clash would not be about politics. It would be about age, experience, and a younger presence unwilling to defer to legend. Number 4. Mario Van Peebles. By the mid-1980s, Clint Eastwood was no longer just a star. He was an institution. Sets moved at his pace. Crews understood his signals without explanation. Efficiency was not requested, it was expected. Then came Heartbreak Ridge, and with it, a younger actor who carried a different energy into the room, Mario Van Peebles. Van Peebles did not arrive to simply occupy space. He arrived expressive, outspoken, socially aware, representing a generation shaped by different conversations. His character brought humor and attitude into a military story grounded in Eastwood's stoic command. On camera, the contrast worked. The tension between old guard discipline and youthful defiance added authenticity. But off-camera, differences in perspective surfaced. Van Peebles would later speak about creative disagreements, about tone, about characterization, about how certain portrayals resonated culturally. Eastwood, protective of his vision, believed in cohesion. He had spent decades refining a system that ran smoothly. He did not welcome disorder. And while no dramatic confrontation defined the production, the friction was unmistakable. A veteran director accustomed to authority, and a younger voice unwilling to dilute his stance. It wasn't disrespect, it was evolution, pressing against tradition. For Eastwood, this chapter underscored something unavoidable. Hollywood was changing. The hierarchy he had mastered was no longer unquestioned. Actors were not simply performers. They were collaborators with opinions shaped by a different era. Because resistance does not always come from ego, sometimes it comes from progress. And yet, even generational tension was not the most difficult test. The next collaboration would bring something heavier. A presence so dominant, so intense, that even Eastwood's steady rhythm felt momentarily disrupted. Number 5. Richard Burton. By the early 1990s, Clint Eastwood had refined his method to near instinct. He trusted silence. He trusted first takes. He trusted restraint. His sets moved with quiet confidence, almost like clockwork. Then came a presence that operated differently, expansive, emotionally immersive, commanding the air around him. Though their eras overlapped more in influence than in extended collaboration, figures like Richard Burton represented a style Eastwood understood but never fully embraced. Theatrical intensity, poetic weight, performance that filled every corner of a frame. Burton's generation believed in verbal firepower, monologues delivered like thunder, emotion projected outward. Eastwood's strength, by contrast, was internal. Minimal words, controlled movement, the power of what was not said. In industry circles and shared spaces, that contrast was felt. Two interpretations of masculinity, two philosophies of screen presence, neither wrong but rarely comfortable side by side. Eastwood once built his career pushing against the louder icons of his time. He became the counterpoint to excess, and as he moved into directing, that philosophy hardened. Less noise, more truth. Working alongside actors shaped by grand theatrical tradition required adjustment. It demanded patience. It forced him to defend his quiet method without attacking theirs. Because when intensity floods a set, even a disciplined system must adapt. For Eastwood, these moments were reminders that control is never absolute. A strong personality can bend the atmosphere simply by existing. And yet, even dominant presence was not the final test. The last chapter would not be about style, politics, or generation. It would be about legacy, about standing beside another legend and realizing that even icons measure themselves against those who came before. Number 6. William Holden. There are moments in a long career when competition is not spoken. It is simply understood. For Clint Eastwood, working in an industry still echoing with the legacy of men like William Holden, carried that quiet weight. Holden belonged to an earlier era of leading men. Polished, commanding, classically composed. His performances were precise, emotionally controlled, yet undeniably powerful. He represented the Hollywood that existed before Eastwood reshaped it with dust-covered anti-heroes and minimalist dialogue. They were not rivals in the tabloid sense. There were no public feuds. But when two icons share overlapping space in history, comparison becomes unavoidable. Eastwood built his reputation by stripping masculinity down to its essentials. Holden had embodied it in its refined Golden Age form. One represented the transition, the other, the foundation. In conversations and industry gatherings, the contrast lingered. Eastwood understood that every generation measures itself against the one before it. Respect was present, but so was awareness. To stand in the same arena as a legend is to feel both pride and pressure. Because legacy is not built in isolation. It is constructed in dialogue with those who came first, and those who challenge you to rise higher. At 95, Clint Eastwood does not look back with resentment. He looks back with clarity. The 6 actors who tested him were not obstacles. They were moments of resistance that strengthened his resolve. Each clash, each disagreement, each silent tension refined the discipline that defined his legacy. Because greatness is not built in comfort. It is shaped in friction. Behind every steady frame he directed and every quiet performance he delivered were lessons learned from those who pushed him the hardest. Pride remains. Achievement remains. But so does reflection. And perhaps that is the true mark of a legend. Not avoiding challenge, but enduring it. If you value stories of legacy, resilience, and untold Hollywood truths, subscribe and join us for the next chapter.